Vice President.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I want to start with words of a very respected woman in our society. Shameful, reprehensible, misogynistic. Those are the words of Fulade Motuta in describing the treatment meted out to her and the members of a committee. And the first two words are very applicable to this government's entire mishandling, bad management, and of course, corruption in this economy in Trinidad and Tobago. It's shameful and it's reprehensible. The Minister of Agriculture said that they got criminal legislation as an achievement. But, Mr. Vice President, what people want is crime to be fixed. When you have over 500 murders in the country, talking about criminal legislation and patting yourself on the back is not what people want. People want you to fix crime. But again, you have a government who is deluded. But you can't blame them, because the loss that they suffered recently has been so debilitating that we can understand that this government simply does not understand that the people of Trinidad and Tobago, they want jobs, not bulbs. And they talk about getting it done. See, the Minister of Agriculture spoke about getting it done and getting the Red House done and so on, but that's a project in continuity. But then, of course, they talk about getting the palace done in Tobago and getting Whitehall done for the minister. But what about the schools in the country? They're not getting that done. I was walking in Valencia, and there's an early childhood center covered with bush in a constituency held by the PNM. Well, it wouldn't be held for any much longer because we have the general election to face. So you see, what the people in Trinidad and Tobago want, and the Minister of Agriculture said that the PNM, the Prime Minister, held himself personally responsible for the Red House being completed. Well, that's okay. But we want him to be personally responsible for taking laptops from children. And on Monday, with the election, they saw that result. People in Separia, people in Sangre Grande, people in San Fernando held, and in Princestown Corporation, held the Prime Minister and the PNM personally responsible for taking away their jobs. Imagine, Mr. Vice President, you going down to our community. People have lost their jobs. Their families cannot see their way. Big men crying. Then the government goes into Santa Flora and breaks down homes on lands that were former petroleum lands. And what they give them? Lights. Lights on grounds. They're thankful for the lights, but what they want is money so they could pay for their own electricity bill so they can light up their own house. Of course, there's a saying in Trinidad and Tobago now that the potholes have little road. They stop calling the roads roads again. There's only potholes across the length and breadth of this country. And when you hear the Minister of Agriculture talking about talk and we talk and so on, we in the UNC passed that, you know. We say talk done. Talk done. Let's get Trinidad and Tobago working again. And of course, the Minister of Agriculture spoke about the PNM. The PNM is the PNM alone. And that the UNC would pull the COP, and they would pull the workers, and they would pull NJAC. Well, what it is we are the whole country. We are the whole country. We represent the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And on the local government election, over 200,000 citizens of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago heard the message, and they sent a message to this government that they are ready for change, talk done, and it's time to get Trinidad and Tobago working again. The other thing that this government has been perpetrating, which is a big fraud, Mr. Vice President, is about heritage making a profit. They debt, the billions of dollars in debt that the Minister of Agriculture talked about paying is PNM debt that Ken Julien and a PNM government created. All right? So they created the debt. Petrotrin was servicing the debt under the Kamala Prasad Bisesa government. They came, they closed down Petrotrin. In fact, telling total untruths, because if you are a citizen of this country, how can you forget? When the Prime Minister himself said it, as we say in Trinidad, with his own mouth, with your own mouth. If, in fact, you were closing the fridge door and you didn't hear me, the government of Trinidad and Tobago is not closing down Petrotrin. And immediately after, like an insult to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, you had Wilfred Espini in a cottage meeting saying, don't call me no hour the night. Don't ask me how much are we going home again. All going home. So the plan of the UNC was never to, will never be, and has never been, and we will never have shut down Petrotrin. And the Minister of Agriculture said there's just 9,000 workers. Well, the thousands of people in Separia East, Separia West, San Francisco, formerly held by the PNM, sent that message that is not just the 9,000 workers. When you close down Petrotrin, you shut down the entire community. The people in Marabella East, even in Marabella West, we came very close. People in Vistabella, by voting for the UNC, sent them a message that when you close down Petrotrin, people in Claxton Bay, when you close down Petrotrin, what you did was you shut down the communities, but the PNM, under this government, they don't care about South. South don't exist. In fact, even their own constituents are irrelevant to them. That is why they could disregard their constituents in South Trinidad. Oh, how far they have fallen from the tree. Because we know the former Prime Minister was a South man to his heart. Not under this incarnation of the PNM. South is a shanty tongue. In the words of the Minister of Finance, San Fernando is a shanty tongue.
I know Kazim will never agree to that.
Under the PNM.
Kazim will never say that.
Another fraud, Mr. Vice President, perpetrated on the people of Trinidad and Tobago by this government is the fraud of the NIF, the National Investment Fund, being successful. And they floated it and it was successful. When a government forces their employees in NIB to purchase the fund, forces their employees in NIB to transfer funds to spend the $1 billion in the NIF, how can you say that was a free and fair float? Is boss the employee, they must do it, or is they lost the work? Of course, again, this is the issue that we have. And when one looks at the Lashley report, Mr. Vice President, the Lashley report never spoke about closing down Petrotrin. Now, I heard a new strange sound tonight, Mr. Vice President. The Minister of Agriculture and leader of government business today has declared to the nation that the highway to Point 14 under the last government, they did not borrow because they wanted to engage in corruption. And then I asked him, have you borrowed? They have not borrowed to fund the highway. Therefore, if anyone says they have borrowed, Mr. Vice President, we know that is total fraud. All right? They have not borrowed the funds required to finance that highway. All right? What they have depended on was the releases from a performance bond. That, of course, was because it was properly secured in a contract by the People's Partnership Government under Kamala Prasad Bisesa. Only when you have a properly engaged contract that you can get a performance bond from it. So, by the very words of the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Vice President, by the very words of the leader of government business today, Mr. Vice President, the fact that this PNM government has not borrowed for the Point 14 highway, it means that they have done that to engage in corruption. They have done that to engage in corruption because that was his words. That was a Freudian slip. It was not meant to leave his mind and reach his lips. But we have caught you tonight. It is because the PNM wanted to engage in corruption, we've heard it from the very lips of the leader of government business tonight in the Senate of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, that they wanted to engage in corruption in the highway to Point 14. I will leave that there. Now, Mr. Vice President, in this country, this government has overseen the departure of ArcelorMittal. They have overseen the departure of that rig construction to Mexico for BP. They have overseen the departure of Yara. The only reason why Yara didn't pick up everything and go, all the stumps and leave, and all the plans didn't shut down is because the government has a stake in one of the plans. I asked the government, from the closure of ArcelorMittal, from the closure of Yara, from the loss of that rig for BP, how much high-level jobs, how many families have suffered because of that negligence? Because you are telling people, we big and bad. We will rough up people. This is we space here. But you see, internationally, negotiations requires sophistication. It requires understanding the issues that are at play. And as we turn to that, I want to turn to a very important thing, because we have said across the length and breadth of this country that the PNM talks. They talk a good talk, but it's just talk. At the end of the day, when you boil down what even the Attorney General has to say about the laws that they create, it's just talk. Where is the action? When you look at the results, the murder rate is the highest it has been consistently in the history of this country under this government, above 500. Now, if that alone should be enough to show the level of ineptitude of this government. However, I want to say that probably the hardest working minister under this government, if anyone works at all, would be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Hey. Because at least he travels to foreign. You know? But even in his travels, the Honorable Minister has overseen the most calamitous mishandling of our foreign policy in this country. Imagine we can't even go to neighbors in Dominica. The people and them get flattened by a hurricane, and we directing ambassadors not to allow them to have a waiver of their funds. So Mr. Vice President, I don't need to go into all the negatives, because, and I can't respond to everything everyone has said, but I will try, because of course we have a bill with 8 material clauses, because the first and the last are immaterial. The first clause is the Treasury Bills Act, and I need to respond to what the Minister of Agriculture said. Now, even if you tell a child, Mr. Vice President, that you have a limit to borrow of $2, or let's say $3, and last year, I increased the limit, you could borrow $5. This year, you can borrow $7. Before it was $3, all the time. And the person comes and they borrow up to the 5, they need to borrow some more. They reach in the 7. Who borrow more? The one who had it at 3, or the one who have it at 7? Even a child, Mr. Vice President, could tell you that it is obvious that the government, under this government, the use of the Treasury bill facility in the central bank is one that is not in accordance with what it is for, and that they have over-abused it. And here's the reason why. They've maxed out the overdraft. They've reached the limit of the overdraft. Based on the formula, revenue projected 47 billion, they should have an overdraft facility at around 9.5 billion. Sorry, no, expenditure figure, 12 billion. So they maxed out the overdraft facility. So therefore, where do they go to borrow? they go to the treasury bill. And you know why they do that? This is the other issue with regard to not being upfront with citizens of this country. When you're not being upfront with citizens of this country, you go through all these simi-dimi approaches to borrow. What they should have done, if they were interested in the proper use of the T-bill facility, if you have borrowed up to 5 billion, you approach your bankers locally because it's local. You try to find a consortium of banks that will lend you $3 billion. You amortize that. You can pay off that in 5 years, 7 years, what have you. And therefore, you have an extra $3 billion within the $5 billion treasury bill limit, so you can continue facilitating short-term borrowings. That is simple finance. Simple finance. But this government, the reason why they will not do that, Mr. Vice President, is because of what the independent Senator Dionarine said. The reason why they will not do that is because they simply are trying to artificially, fraudulently, keep the debt to GDP level below 65%. That is fraud. That is financial management fraud in the fiscal management of the resources of this country. This government is perpetrating fraud on the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in the way that they are mismanaging the finances. So in fact, this first clause regarding the Treasury Bills Act should never see the light of day. It should never. They should have simply taken off part of the debt that they are trying to refinance and take a long-term loan or a medium-term loan. So we move on to another clause. Now, clause 3 speaks to the Income Tax Act to provide for the increase in solar water heating. That has been there, it's just increased to 100%. But people around the country are saying, I mean, they gave this government is an upside-down government. Put the cart before the horse, they gave you water tanks, they don't have water. In the campaign in Belmont last year, in the by-election, people complained to Senator Mark they haven't had water for 3 weeks. We had to approach WASA and basically lay down the rule.
Read the riot act.
We had to read the riot act to WASA because this government, certainly this Minister of Public Utilities, has fallen asleep on the job. But the licks that they got in Separia and Sangre Grande, if they were sleeping for 4 years, they'd wake them up. And they are now standing up and recognizing that the people are not buying their story. So you give them water tanks, but no water to put in it. Solar water heaters, but no water to heat. Pothole patching, but the whole road in the country bad. Saying they care for education, but you're closing down schools. And you're taking away access to gate. Telling people if you're 50 years, you're too old. In a society where the retirement age has already increased in many private institutions to 65 years, it has already increased. So what you are telling someone is, despite your ambition at 50, you are not entitled to improve your retirement position. You don't deserve education, despite having contributed to the development of this country. Hospitals with no medication, not even a Panadol in some, and when you're lucky, you might get one medication, you can't get the other. To get gas, Mr. Vice President, this government manufactures crisis after crisis. You have a situation where we are talking about the Petroleum Taxes Act. We are talking about amending the corporation tax for certain allowances. But you have a situation where the government, Mr. Vice President, the government is trying to railroad a private company, a large employer of citizens in this country, simply to prove a political point that they have failed in closing down the Petrotrin refinery. And after that failure, you now have a situation where Unipet couldn't get gas. You manufacture a crisis, the $100 bill, and next crisis. The only thing, Mr. Vice President, that was trending on social media today more than the lady and I feel sorry for a family who fainted outside of a commercial bank waiting for $100 bills to be changed, is the Minister of National Security assaulting a citizen on social media. Now, so Mr. Vice President, I want to turn to another clause in this bill. This clause is clause 8, which seeks to amend the Cooperative Societies Act to increase the sum of money payable to a nominee or legal personal representative of a deceased member. And Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Labour spoke a lot about value under the ministry, and there's a team, and so on. But I want to submit that the only team that is being prepared in the Ministry of Labour is the team that wants to get rid of this minister. Because under this minister, Mr. Vice President, there is a suspension of the Commissioner for Cooperative Development, who got his job in a proper employment mechanism. It was the first time in years, because it was a pre-retirement post, that a Commissioner for Cooperatives was appointed after on a system of merit and not seniority. It was properly advertised, subject to an IDB recommendation. There were consultants brought in the ministry. I was one of those, but I left on my own to continue my studies, to do my master's. The consultants who were brought in, one of them was removed. The minister, Mr. Vice President, needs to re-examine what is the role and function of a minister in a government ministry. And I will leave that there. Now, cooperatives, and I want to say this is one point I want to say about the cooperatives after the result of that minister suspending the commissioner. After that suspension, Mr. Vice President, there are a couple of cooperatives who I'm very familiar with who ceased operations as cooperatives because they were told by staff in the ministry that if they were to approve the liability, the maximum liability limits for the cooperatives, they could lose their job just like their boss, the commissioner. So can you imagine? This minister, under this minister's hand, the ministry has crippled non-financial cooperatives. What are those? Those are cooperatives that run supermarkets and gas stations and so on. Because what they were accustomed to based on their interpretation of the law, there is something else that is happening. So now, many of those cooperatives have decided, you know what, we don't need to function as a cooperative again. And that is crippling, because what organizations judge in the public service, judge their performance levels by, especially organizations like these, is how many organizations you can create on a given year and how much assets under control of those organizations you can build. And that is how you show growth, and that is how you show relevance. And that is why the cooperatives division was relevant. Now that the current minister has taken over the ministry, you are seeing issues there. So I want to tell the government that even when they act, it seems not to be in the interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to turn to the amendment to the Income Tax Act. Sorry, the Corporation Tax Act, I apologize. So when one looks at the Corporation Tax Act, Mr. Vice President, I listened attentively to the members of the independent bench, and they made some interesting points about culture. There are two prongs that one must look at culture in this country when you are financing culture. One is you must have a cultural policy in place. I know persons in this parliament are very familiar with me advocating for a trade policy, which I take credit for it being ready in the timing that it had been. And there's another aspect of culture that is creative industry policy, which I'm sure Senator Paul Richards will be very familiar with, the fact that we don't have one in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, cultural policy, Mr. Vice President, seeks to protect aspects of culture that aren't necessarily commercially viable. People ask, well, why are you paying money for somebody to learn to sing calypso or pichikari, and they're just 4 and 5 and 6 years old? And they will never make money necessarily from that. The point is, you protect the culture at that level so you can have the Marshall Montanos at this level. So the Marshall Montano and the Voice and the Blacks and the KI and the RVBs, they will form part of the creative industry focus. But you must protect persons at the ground level. I'm bringing all this to say that no connection has been made in the law. So it's a point as an opportunity for improvement. So whilst I'm saying it might be good for companies to provide, to benefit from a tax break, to support entities in the creative and cultural sector, I'm saying there's an opportunity for improvement in the law to the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance. So to make a connection between export orientation and commercial viability. Now, so what it means is this. If, for instance, you look at the total amount of revenue lost to the state, let's say it's $1 billion from companies claiming from taxes, tax coverage. And there's no mechanism, Mr. Vice President, to measure how much revenue was generated from this tax break. Because I'm sure when persons donate to cultural events and so on, and sponsor cultural events, many of these events earn income. When persons sponsor albums and books and so on, and works of art, many of these things earn income. What it accrues to the state is another issue. So if we can have these cultural persons who benefit from this tax break report to some arm of the state, whether it be the BIR or whoever, the earnings that they would have generated, persons employed and so on, what it does is it provides a measurement mechanism for the creative industry policy. When it seeks, however, to protect now and it's non-commercial, there should be a mechanism where the ministry not only just has them on a register, but it states where it is connected to the cultural integrity of Trinidad and Tobago. I know some attempt has been made by connecting works of visual art to art gallery, but of course, we need to know if someone is donating and covering an artist, if they earned money. Not for the government to see how much money they made necessarily, but for us to have a fair measure of how valuable this fiscal measure is in terms of dollars and cents, wherever it can be calculated. So these are two issues that I wanted to bring to the fore. Because the income and the reports so derived should be given to the relevant ministries of trade and finance to measure the impact of the cultural industry on the cultural industry of their policy. Now, once you talk about corporation tax, Mr. Vice President, it brings you to a very relevant point to this entire debate, which is VAT refunds. Because one reason why you would give a company 150% rebate is because you're considering the timing of their cash flows. That is really, it assists them with cash management, and it gives them an incentive to engage in the activity, recognizing that sponsors also give more than dollars. They may give some resources when they are assessing whether or not to assist or not to assist a cultural venture. So the VAT refunds mechanism of the government was raised by an independent senator. But one lamentation is that the government still has not clarified as yet exactly what will be the term of the bonds. We hear it's 1.5%. But when you look at the yield curve of Trinidad and Tobago, 1.5%, Mr. Vice President, is definitely not a medium-term bond. So how long would be the term of these bonds? Is it a 5-year bond you're going to be giving the companies at 1.5%? That means the government is not necessarily being fair. They should give them something that matches the yield curve. Now, there are some issues with the Insurance Act, and I will leave that there at this point in time, only to say that any change that is in line with the changes that were made when we amended the Insurance laws of Trinidad and Tobago last session are welcomed. However, we will wait to see how it works itself out in actual realization of a stronger and more robust insurance industry in Trinidad and Tobago. So I will leave that, I will give some time where that is concerned. I want to turn my attention to the monetary policy report. Because, Mr. Vice President, when you turn to the monetary policy report of November 2019, and you turn to page 12 of this report, you talk about the energy sector and economic activity. One thing this government has not been doing is giving credit where it is due. Here it is the central bank, under real economic activity, is saying after being boosted in the first quarter by the coming on stream of the Angeline facility in February 2019, natural gas production turned downward because of a shutdown. So what they are saying is, in the first quarter of this year, the Angeline facility came on stream, and that increased and boosted output in terms of gas, and that was as a direct result of People's Partnership government policies. A direct result of that. Crude oil output, however, fell by 12.1%, and we know why. That had to do with Petrotrin. So thank you, so Mr. Vice President. When we look at refining activity declining by 17% and so on, we see that the economy, all the noises they make about heritage and paria and so on, it is to distract us from the reality that they have failed. They have failed the energy sector in this country. This government has collapsed the energy sector in this country. You have crude oil production declining significantly, and there is nothing positive in sight. Now, there's a very disturbing statistic here. And it reminds me of the stories you're seeing in the newspaper, Mr. Vice President, with women going to groceries and shoplifting basic food items. But of course, what do you expect after you take away 18,000 food cards from families? And of course, you've lost over 50,000 jobs in this country. This government has forced the population to starvation. When you look at the statistics here, it says that lower sales in major retail categories such as supermarkets and groceries, 5.5%. So even the statistics are bearing what we know to be a fact, that the people simply can't afford to buy food. And when one turns to the labor market, I saw the Minister of Labor in some forum in South, shamelessly in Saparia, after closing down Petrotrin, cancelling thousands of jobs down there. Because it was not just persons working in the oil sector. They also created jobs within the communities, which the minister would have known as a former head of PSA. After closing down Petrotrin, losing so many jobs, going down there to say thank the government for adding jobs to the economy. Shameless. Even by this statistic, you have 8,500 persons this year alone, Mr. Vice President, leaving the labor force. That means that they're not even interested in looking for work because there's no work to be found. And when you look at job advertisements, declining by 10% just from last year to this year. And then the big one, total public sector debt growing by $8 billion, from 95 to $103 billion. And a significant part of that increase, Mr. Vice President, is from Treasury bills, which is supposed to be debt for sterilization purposes, not long-term debt. So this government is hiding long-term debt in the figure for Treasury bills. So, Mr. Vice President, when we look at this bill here, even when it should have been a good measure, we have some challenges because, of course, the people of Trinidad and Tobago have come to a realization that this is a government that simply has its priorities screwed. Their priority is not on the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The priority is not on planning. Imagine the shock and the awe of losing an election. Mr. Vice President, that shock had have been so great to have the Minister of Agriculture to come here as leader of government business to say that we on this side do not have a plan. Can you imagine that? Thank you, Mr. Vice President. So, I want to go to two elements of our plan: the creative industries strengthening our national identity. Because unlike the shoutings and the rantings of the Minister of Agriculture today, we in the UNC take time and plan. And Mr. Vice President, the only time that we get aggressive is when we realize that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are being taken for a ride by this government. Taken for a ride. So Mr. Vice President, creative industries. When we get into government, in some 9 short months, unless of course they are minded to call the election early and put themselves out of their collective misery. When we come to government in 9 short months, the people of Trinidad and Tobago will benefit from a steel pan factory. Not the one that the Member of Parliament for Laventille West thinks is sufficient. Because Panland can't even supply the Pan in Schools program. They could be adequately resourced, but not in their current location and current size and capacity. So we are going to build out steel pan manufacturing in this country. And I speak also as a pan man myself. I'm a base man. I know you wouldn't expect anything less. Base man. Well, for the PNM is the base man from hell, but for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, I'm the base man. So, Mr. Vice President, we are going to create a creative arts street, a carnival in a box franchise. Now, of course, after the PNM has disenfranchised and created mass unemployment, you need to have quick, low-hanging fruit opportunities for persons to get jobs, and this is one such sector. Now, Mr. Vice President, this government is so short. This government is so short on skilled persons, so short on implementers, that they had to come and borrow our Minister of National Security. They had to come and borrow our Minister of Culture. They even tried to borrow our slogans tonight talking about talk. But of course, the people of Trinidad and Tobago will not be fooled. Because you see, we understand that the PNM talks, a good talk, but talk done. The time talk for talk is done. Now, so I want to say for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, if you're watching your television and you're closing your fridge door and you didn't hear, when the United National Congress returns to government, we will reopen the refinery for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, the people in South Trinidad, and of course, the oil workers. When we return to government, Mr. Vice President, for all the young people listening and watching on YouTube, we will give every single child as a right, as an entitlement, entering secondary school, a laptop computer. Every child without fail. The only thing we might do is go better and give them a tablet. Of course, Mr. Vice President, we will reopen the GATE program. This government talks about tourism and sandals, but they close down access to tourism education. Yes. We will reopen the GATE program so that persons, even persons in their 50s, the silver economy, our persons who want to contribute to their country, who want to improve their qualification status after having given their lives to Trinidad and Tobago. We will reopen the GATE program and give them access because we are government for the people. Now, Mr. Vice President, I know it is hard for the PNM after losing in Siparia, after losing in Grandy, but it is clear. The people are ready for change. They are ready for the United National Congress. And try as they like, the next election, and next year this time, we will be on that side, and they will be on this side. I thank you.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Don't forget there will be a court also.
That's the only true thing you say.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
That's the only true thing you say. They will be in court.
Mr. Vice President, during long stretches of this debate, I was trying to remember whether it was a finance debate or a political platform. I will try to stick with the issues that are actually before us. So I will try to address and give responses to the questions that were raised, the comments that were made, starting with the incentives in respect of the energy sector. Senator Mark, in typical style, condemned the 5% credit for the SPT. He said it was too minuscule. It would have no effect on exploration activity. He also condemned the readjustment of the capital allowance program in the energy sector, saying that we were reversing the UNC initiatives, which we will admit we did deliberately. It would make Trinidad and Tobago less effective. I want to remind the people of Trinidad and Tobago that the reason why we reversed, or we are seeking to reverse, the incentives given to the energy sector is that while it encouraged activity in the energy sector, it produced no return for Trinidad and Tobago. We have a wasting asset, a valuable asset. Unless the people of Trinidad and Tobago get value now for this asset, what is the point of giving all of these incentives? It makes more sense to leave the asset in the ground. So, as we have said ad infinitum, we had discussions with the energy sector to come to a understanding of how we should move forward in a way that they can benefit and we can benefit, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, that is, and we came to a position where everybody accepts that the 20% on a straight line basis makes sense for everybody. Having come to those determinations, the energy sector immediately said, we are going to continue investment. They have committed to contributor investing $10 billion within the next 5 years. I don't see how in those circumstances we can say with a straight face that we are chasing away the energy sector and we are making Trinidad and Tobago less attractive. What we are doing is trying to ensure that the people of Trinidad and Tobago benefit from its resource. Senator Diona Ryan, in respect of the energy sector, raised the issue of transfer pricing and wondered when we were going to address it. What we decided to do in transfer pricing, which is something that we have been looking at, is start with the impact on the energy sector, because that is the sector that would have the most impact in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of income return. We had discussions with the energy sector to address the leakages that had been identified in the way the energy sector was operated. Now, what would happen is that we sold, when Atlantic LNG produced liquefied natural gas, it was sold to members, essentially, of the energy sector, and they would take it and sell it wherever. What would happen, because they operate a global conglomerate, is that they would sell it to a place where the price of energy is low. So say, for example, the States, in the initial stage, and report to Trinidad the profits made on that sale. But thereafter, they would turn around and sell it to a place where the price of gas was high. And of course, Trinidad did not feature in that transaction, and we lost revenue because of that. So what we have agreed with them, we have agreed two things with them. One, Trinidad and Tobago will sell its own gas share, as opposed to having somebody else sell it for us. And two, we would come up with a price for the gas based on a mixed basket. So we get a reasonable average of the prices of gas available. And that way, the energy company gets some benefit, but Trinidad increases the benefit that it gets. So that is how we are dealing with transfer pricing in the initial stage in respect to the energy sector. And we will, in the not too distant future, come with legislation to deal with transfer pricing on a more global basis. Treasury bills. Senator Mark said that in increasing the minister's ability to borrow under the Treasury bill legislation, we would crowd out the public sector. Now, you would recall they said the same thing when we offered the NIF, that we would absorb all the liquidity in the industry and nobody else would be able to borrow. That did not happen. The NIF was oversubscribed, and still there's ability to borrow in the market. So I put no credence on that comment from Senator Mark. He said it would create an increase in the rate of interest. Again, that is tied to whether or not the market becomes illiquid. And since we don't accept that the market will become illiquid, we do not accept that there will be an increase in the interest rate as a result of the minister's ability to borrow more on a short-term basis via the Treasury bill mechanism. He said, too, that we had no clue on how to make the economy work. And this took me back to Calypso that was sung around 2002 by Calypsonian Bally Ballantyne. It actually took him to the Young Kings. He got the crown for Young Kings in that year, and I think the Calypso is very, very clever. The chorus is, jump high, jump low, shake your manifesto, Ramage, come let me Ramage. And I remember that on the 11th of October 2019, the leader of the opposition went to the other place. She jumped high, she jumped low, she shook her manifesto, and she ramaged. And in the middle of all of that, her solution to fixing the economy of Trinidad and Tobago were increase interest rates, which of course all of a sudden Senator Mark is concerned about, and devalue the dollar. That is the plan, the main elements of the plan for the UNC. And as I indicated previously, the plan for the UNC for the economy changes every other week. But on the last occasion that the leader spoke, her plan was to increase interest rates and devalue the dollar. I don't think that will provide comfort to anybody in Trinidad and Tobago that that is the plan of the other side. The status of the overdraft, Senator Diona Ryan raised the issue of whether we were seeking to increase the borrowing limit under the Treasury bill mechanism because we had maxed out the overdraft, and I will say to you that is not in fact the case. The overdraft I was advised, by the end of the week will be in the region of 80%, so there is quite a lot of capacity. But as I indicated to you in my initial presentation, the rate of interest on the overdraft is 5%. The rate of interest on Treasury bill is around 2 or below. We acknowledge that our cost of borrowing is significant. Interest represents a significant part of the overall budget, and what we're trying to do is manage and reduce that. So in going for Treasury bills rather than borrowing on the overdraft, or as Senator Obika advised, changing short-term borrowing into long-term borrowing on the open market, we will reduce the price of interest. Now, the main reason why we need the short-term borrowing facility is that it's for cash flow management. For example, in the first 3 months of the fiscal year, there is very little income flowing into the government. Between the end of September, when we get the last quarterly installment, and December, where we get the first, there is very little money coming to the government. We still have salaries to pay, we have bills to meet, and so the Minister of Finance needs the leeway to be able to put his hands on cash easily and quickly and cheaply to cover his bills while he waits on the inflows to start. And with the intention being that as the inflows start, we will clear off at least some of the short-term facility. So that is the reason why we are trying to give him more flexibility, especially having regard to the fairly significant difference between the rates of interest at which he can borrow. The promotional allowance, I want to respond to a comment made by Senator Dionarine that while she supports the promotional allowance, she is concerned that it should not be a long-term measure because it is protectionist and it will make the manufacturers and other people who benefit from the allowance more inefficient because they are getting a tax support. But what I would like to draw to Senator Dionarine's attention is that a manufacturer, for example, can only continue to benefit from the promotional allowance year after year if that entity or that person keeps increasing the level of their exports. So you have to have incremental increases and or you have to move to new markets. So it's not that you move into a market, benefit from the promotional allowance year after year, and you just don't have to do anything more. You sell the same number of whatever it is, soft drinks or chocolates or whatever it is. You have to keep increasing the size of your market, which would mean generating more foreign exchange, and it's only on that basis that you get the promotional allowance. Another thing is the promotional allowance applies only in respect of very specific expenses. The bulk of the expenses that contribute to the efficiency or inefficiency of an operation are not featured in the list of allowances to which attracts the promotional allowance. So the cost of labor, the efficiency of how you operate your business, the cost of rent, plant and machinery, how you keep that efficient, all of these things do not go towards giving you a benefit under the promotional allowance provision. So that I don't think that in this particular case, maintaining the allowance over a period will cause the manufacturer or whoever to become more inefficient because he will have to maintain his level of efficiency or improve the level of efficiency to keep expanding his market. And it is only when he continues to expand his market that he continues to be entitled to the benefit. Cooperative society. There were two essential comments made, one by Senator Sobers, one by Senator Thompson-Ahi. Senator Sobers talked about the fact that the benefit is open to abuse, and he gave a clear example of circumstances where he saw that happen. Senator Ahi, on the other hand, indicated that we should remove the limit altogether. I am not objecting to either comment. I think both have merits. But I would say, one, that the abuse that may or may not arise under the legislation that's currently drafted arises from the way the provision is actually administered by the cooperatives and not a defect of the legislation. So we have to ensure that the cooperatives administer the legislation more robustly, which leads me to the Senator Thompson-Ahi's comment in that we should remove the incentive. And I don't think that that is an issue that we have dismissed. It is just that we recognize in discussions with the credit union that it is necessary to regulate this thing that I call a sleeping giant in Trinidad and Tobago. The credit union movement is a massive movement. It controls a significant amount of assets. And at the moment, regulation of that industry is relatively non-existent. So we have discussed with the movement creating a regulatory framework which is more robust for the purpose of protecting the membership. And in that kind of atmosphere, I can see us reverting to a discussion as to how we treat with this death benefit. A correction to a couple of comments made by Senator Dial Singh in respect of the art and culture allowance. Senator Dial Singh expressed concern that because the ministry supposedly has a part to play in respect of the promotion allowance, that opens the door for abuse. But I want to dispel that, because if you look at the legislation, it says that somebody who makes a contribution to, in respect of art, for example, can get the allowance if the person who benefits is a national of Trinidad and Tobago, and that person is registered with the Ministry of Culture and the Arts. That is all. The Ministry of Culture and the Arts does not have to approve the nature of the art or performing art or visual art. It doesn't have to assess the value of it or anything of the sort. All it has to do is acknowledge that this artist is registered with the ministry. So in my view, in those circumstances, there is no room for mischief by the public servants. In respect of sport, the allowance in respect of sport, again, you qualify if the sportsman who you're sponsoring is a national and if he is involved in a listed sport. The only involvement of the Ministry of Sport is that the minister has the power under the legislation to add to or subtract from the list of sports in respect of which you can get the allowance. In those circumstances, I don't see avenue for mischief. So I'd like to dispel that concern. So moving on to Senator Obika's very colorful contribution. He said to start with that he didn't dispute Senator Brambarat's claim that there was corruption involved in the building of the highway under the last administration. But what he tried to say is that there's also corruption under this administration because we're not borrowing. And that could not be further from the truth. Now, we will acknowledge that we didn't have to borrow at the start, because I will remind you that my colleague from Ministry of Works and others have said to this House that one of the first things we did when we came into this administration was to seek to recover the money under the bond that the UNC sought to deprive this country of by removing the clause from the contract. So there was a contract between the contractor and the ministry, which said that in the event that the contractor became bankrupt, the contractor would have to pay the ministry an amount under this bond. The night before the election, that clause was removed from the contract. The night before the election. In September 7th, 2015, it was removed from the contract. We recovered it, but we didn't recover it because the UNC was so astute in their contract negotiations and put that clause in to protect us. We recovered it because we had to go to court in England and fight tooth and nail to get that money back. And the court decided it wasn't proper for the government to remove that clause, and the country was entitled to recover that money, and that is how we recovered it. And it's still under arbitration, I'm being advised. But they have told us that notwithstanding the fact that it's under arbitration, we can go ahead and spend the money. So the minister took those funds and restarted the highway. What he also did that deferred our need to borrow for the highway was that he said we are not going back and giving this entire huge project to one foreign contractor. We're going to break it up into parts and give it to smaller contractors who will come in at lower than the big contractor came in at and manage the $952 million that we recovered under the bond. So that's what we did. So when we started, we didn't have to borrow. But the total cost of finishing the highway is $3 billion. We only recovered $952 million, and we're not interested in getting involved in any corrupt practices. So to finance the balance of the highway, we borrowed twice, under two loans, $200 million from CAF, that's the Latin American Bank, and $600 million from Anson McCall. So anytime Senator Obika is prepared to dispute those facts, he can let me know, and we will provide the necessary additional information. So we have borrowed, we are properly managing the construction, we are tracking, we are seeking to address the issue of having to pay 2 and 3 times for the same pieces of land, but that's another matter. So that is how we handle major projects under this administration. Senator Obika threw out who borrowed more. I will just lay 2 sets of facts on the table. In 2010, the borrowing was 29% of GDP. By 2015, and this is after the most significant budgets and flow of income the country has ever seen, reaching up to $62 billion. By 2014, the borrowing had moved from 29% of GDP to 49% of GDP. That is a 20% jump. We have continued to borrow, and we have explained on several occasions why we've had to continue to borrow, but we have moved the borrowing from 49% of GDP to 62% of GDP, which is a 13% jump. So I will leave you with the question unanswered, who borrowed more? NIF, Senator Obika said NIF is a failure because we forced NIB to borrow. Now, NIB is a creature that is responsible for paying pensions to hundreds of thousands of people in Trinidad and Tobago. It has a huge long-term liability. It is always looking for assets in which to invest. Any investor, whether it is a private investor, any bond issuer, whether it's a private bond issuer or a public bond issuer, when they are seeking to issue bonds, considers, will NIB be interested in this because it is so significant a player in the market. So one would expect NIB to want to invest in a bond like this because of the attractive nature, because it's tax-free, because it gives an excellent return, because it's long-term and matches their long-term liability. So if Senator Obika is so convinced that the only reason that NIB invested in NIF was because they were forced to do that by the government, I would like him to explain to me why all the pension funds managers decided to invest in NIF. If it was so unattractive and the only reason why NIB would have invested is because they were forced to do so. So nothing could be further from the truth regarding the success of NIB. Once again, I will clarify for the rest of Trinidad and Tobago, the government of Trinidad and Tobago did not take away food cards from people. It said to people, we don't know what happened between 2010 and 2015 with the food cards. Come in and reapply if you qualify for a food card. In that exercise, 18,000 people failed to reapply for a food card. That, to me, says a lot. So we didn't take away everybody who applied for and qualified for a food card, got a food card, and is now getting relief from the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And we are supporting the most vulnerable in society. We continue to do that. So, Mr. Vice President, As I would have indicated during my presentation, the provisions of the bill before us are by and large to legislate for the measures that we addressed in the budget. We are seeking to do several things. We are seeking to increase the borrowing limit under the Treasury Bill Act from $5 billion to $7 billion. We are seeking to give the energy sector relief in certain areas to encourage, on the one hand, their activity, and on the other, to ensure that we recover more revenue from them. And that would be adjustment of the loss relief, adjustment of the capital allowance, and adjustment of the allowance under the SPT regime. We are seeking to increase the benefits available to companies that contribute to people in the creative and sporting and production sectors by increasing the amount of the allowance that they are entitled to from $3 million where it is now to $6 billion a year, where we are hoping, where we are seeking to take it. We are seeking to encourage the increased investment in solar panels by increasing the benefit that households can get in respect of the purchase of solar panels from 25% of the cost to 100% of the cost. And to answer a question that was raised by Senator Remy, we are seeking a 10% reduction, a 10% shift to renewable energy by 2021. There is a measure subject to discussion now and decision that will keep us on track to attain that goal, and we will continue to build. Yes, to answer another question that you asked, we are determined to implement. It's not just a piece of paper that we want to put on the shelf. As Senator LeHunt would have indicated, Minister of Public Admin, we have identified a resource that is at the Parliamentary Secretary level who is responsible for that program alone, because we are serious about getting it done. Not only do we have a global commitment, but more importantly, we have a commitment to the people of Trinidad and Tobago to get this done and get this done right. I believe we are adjusting the death benefit payable under the Cooperatives Act, and I would have explained why we are doing this as possibly a step towards a more liberal approach, which we will examine at the appropriate time. We are also seeking to amend the regime for the taxation of insurance companies to bring it into alignment with the new insurance regime as introduced in the Insurance Bill of 2018 that should be proclaimed shortly. And in essence, those are the provisions that are covered by this relatively brief and fairly straightforward bit of legislation. As I said, we are seeking to keep on track with the commitments that we made in the budget statement. This seeks to do that. I recommend to you that you give it your favorable consideration. I ask for your support. I thank you, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled an act to provide for the imposition of variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled an act to provide for the imposition or variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 57-2, I beg to move that the bill not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the bill entitled an act to provide for the imposition or variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Honourable Senators, the question therefore is that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Imposition or Variation of Certain Duties and Taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Imposition or Variation of Certain Duties and Taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that this Senate do now adjourn to Friday, December 13, 2019 at 10 a.m. On that day, Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to debate the Dangerous Drugs Amendment Bill 2019, which will be considered by the House tomorrow. Mr. Vice President, just to be clear, there are two bills related to cannabis which have been laid in the House. The bill we intend to deal with on Friday, December 13, 2019, is the Dangerous Drugs Amendment Bill 2019, which is a bill which seeks to decriminalize the possession of not more than 30 grams of cannabis or not more than 5 grams of cannabis resin. I thank you.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for two matters to be raised on the motion for the adjournment of the Senate. Senator Mark.
Okay. Just want to advise Mr. Vice President that I shall be pursuing only one. Okay. That is the one on social services. Yeah. Mr. Vice President, the issue of the need for the government to restructure business operations at the Tunapuna office of the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services with a view to ensuring more efficient service delivery to customer is of grave importance and significance. We have understaffing at this office. We have a lack of resources. There's an absence of adequate facilities for those who have to access the services of this particular ministry. Mr. Vice President, the process of obtaining one's old age pension is extremely frustrating and burdensome for many of our citizens. A citizen applies to the ministry and submits all his or her relevant documents. Sometimes these citizens, when they return, are told that their documents have been misplaced. Mr. Vice President, once you arrive at this office, a number is given to you as you seek an audience with the relevant officer. At times there is only one officer assigned to a district. Mr. Vice President, this in itself is a nightmare for those pensioners or prospective pensioners. Could you imagine, Mr. Vice President, a situation involving over 70 potential applicants for pensions waiting to be interviewed by one officer. And at times, when that process would have begun, lunchtime arrives. And with lunchtime arriving, the agony is extended for these persons who are seeking to secure their pension as senior citizens. Mr. Vice President, it can take up to 14 months before you can actually secure your pension, sometimes even beyond that time. What is even more disturbing is the attitude that is displayed by staffers, which leaves a lot to be desired. Some of our older citizens and physically challenged ones are sometimes in great difficulty when they are at this particular location. Mr. Vice President, my information is that there is only one washroom at this office to accommodate both female and male. We have an emergency where there's an absence of soap and toiletries at this very facility. And with so many chronic diseases floating around, we understand the danger that such an environment can pose to our citizens who are seeking to access their pension. The question that I am posing to the government this evening is, why does this process have to be so long, especially for our senior citizens and those, Mr. Vice President, who may be suffering from physical disabilities? The entire system needs to be revamped, needs to be revised, and comprehensively reviewed. Mr. Vice President, my information reveals that one of the requirements needed for processing one's application is to secure one's overseas travel records from the Immigration Department. And this requirement places on the shoulder of the applicant to access information from the Immigration Department for the last 20 years. Mr. Vice President, this is a very primitive system, and as I said, needs to be reviewed and revisited. We need to have a more modern, technologically advanced operation at these outlets or these offices. And therefore, I'm calling on the government this evening to deal with this issue. I would also like the government to indicate what is the time frame it takes for the board to make a decision on an application? Because it seems, Mr. Vice President, it varies and it's all over the place. There's no standards or set protocols in this regard. And it therefore takes an inordinately long period of time for decisions to be taken by these boards that are responsible for final action on applications. Mr. Vice President, citizens are called upon, senior citizens are called upon to sit at these offices for long, long hours. And they do not get the kind of love, attention, courtesy from the staffers. And it is against this background, I am saying, Mr. Vice President, that we need to pay attention to what is happening. Mr. Vice President, would you believe that our parents who have turned, 65, they are being called to line up in the morning outside of social services offices as early as 5 a.m. simply to await the opening of these offices to secure a number so that they can be first in line. This cannot be proper, and it cannot be fair and acceptable in a society that has a respect for the elderly and has a respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I rise to respond to the appeal of my senatorial colleague and wish to place the following statement on the records. Within recent years, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services has undergone significant changes in organizational structure and mandate. It is recognized that the core function of the ministry is to protect and care for the needs of the vulnerable among us. Accordingly, the ministry has spent considerable effort examining the social services delivery system to ensure that it is, among other things, relevant, efficient, and client-friendly. The ministry is aware that an area of concern is the quality of customer service provided to its clients. Consequently, the issue of improving customer service is a priority in the strategic plan, which is aligned to Vision 2030 development plan and its focus on a modern, effective, and efficient public service. Mr. Vice President, in 2018, the ministry embarked on a transformation initiative through two critical institutional strengthening projects. One, the restructuring of the ministry as agreed to by Cabinet, and two, a diagnostic assessment and service improvement project for the Social Welfare Division. Both projects are being undertaken in collaboration with the Ministry of Public Administration. Whilst the first project is ministry focused, the second is related solely to the Social Welfare Division and will entail the following. One, an in-depth diagnostic assessment on the operations of the division. Two, development and implementation of a comprehensive integrated service improvement plan based on the results of the assessment. Three, development and implementation of a comprehensive change management and communications plan for the transformation of the Social Welfare Division. And four, evaluation of the impact of the project on the division's operations. Mr. Vice President, in addition to the following, business process mapping, current, interim, and future state process maps, establishment of performance standards, business process management, policy formulation, updates, including legislative reviews, automation of processes, and development of service standards and charter. It is expected that significant elements of the project will be completed by January 2020 and will reflect greater effectiveness and efficiency in the operations of the Social Welfare Division. Mr. Vice President, prior to the diagnostic assessment, the ministry identified areas for improvement and has already taken steps to or implemented the following in an effort to resolve some of the concerns raised by my senatorial colleague and also to address some of the challenges in the division. 1, staffing. The ministry is working with the Service Commission's department with a view to implementing an interim solution to filling of vacancies and staff shortages throughout the division. 18 intake officers were assigned to the various social welfare offices from September 2019. The intake officers have responsibility for the assessment and eventual intake of applications from all new persons visiting the offices. Such persons will no longer have to wait in line, Senator Mark, will no longer have to wait in line with persons who are already receiving services. It is expected that the wait time for such persons will be significantly reduced. This initiative will also allow field officers more time to focus on their core functions. A total of 33 new staff members, including the 18 intake officers, were exposed to a comprehensive orientation session in October 2019 to ensure that they are adequately equipped to service the clients of the division. The training included a customer service component. In seeking to ensure the ministry staff are knowledgeable and possess the appropriate skills and attitudes, a series of training and retraining sessions on its products, services, and customer care were conducted in 2018 and involved staff at all levels. Another round of training will commence in the first quarter of fiscal 2020. Operational improvements. Introduction of a standard means test in March 2018 as the mechanism for determining an individual or household eligibility for certain grants. This has made targeting more effective. The ministry engaged ECLAC to conduct a review of the SMT, that's the standard means test, to determine its suitability or robustness as a targeting mechanism in identifying poor and vulnerable households. A report has been prepared and reviewed by ministry officials, and relevant recommendations will be implemented to improve the standard means test in the first quarter of fiscal 2020. Development and introduction of a single intake form that can be utilized on multiple grants. Expansion of the direct deposit system to include persons in receipt of the Public Assistance Grant and Disability Assistance Grant. This will ensure that clients are not inconvenienced by postal delay or theft. As at September 2019, 79,996 grant recipients had been transitioned to the direct deposit method of payment. Mr. Vice President, operationalization of the MOU signed with the Registrar General Department in 2018 allows the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to have updated information on deaths and to remove deceased recipients on a timely basis. The ministry is also finalizing a similar MOU with the Immigration Department, which will result in eventual removal of the existing life certificate system. Implementation of the recently signed MOU with iGovTT is expected to commence in January 2020 and will expand the number of service locations where the ministry's services will be available. Additionally, an MOU signed with NIB, TT, will provide access to sharing of information from January 2020 and will allow for faster processing of applications. Rollout of social services client management system. This will support the aforementioned MOUs as well as automate a number of paper-based processes currently being used by the division. This is an interim solution pending implementation of an integrated IT system known as ISEMS that iGovTT has been engaged to procure and manage. ISEMS will allow the linking of clients to case management records, effective management of the grant portfolio, and the monitoring, evaluation, and auditing of programmers. Mr. Vice President, the ministry implemented an application management system from October 2019, which includes acknowledgement of receipt of applications, confirmation of documents received, and advice on documents outstanding for the processing of applications. The ministry has increased and will continue to provide community outreach programs and public information, education, and sensitization, known as PIES, sessions throughout Trinidad and Tobago. With effect from November 2019, the ministry commenced the process of providing customer feedback forms, which will provide the customer with the opportunity to evaluate the service received. Finally, Mr. Vice President, it is anticipated that the foregoing measures will redound to the improvements in customer service delivery in the medium to long term in the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for presenting me with an opportunity to lay this statement on behalf of the Minister of Social Development and Family Services, the Honorable I'm tired. Sherry Critchlow Coburn. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Honorable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Friday, December the 13th, 2019 at 10 a.m. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate now stands adjourned to Friday, December the 13th, 2019 at 10 a.m.